Welcome to Albany Law Review's annual Fall Symposium. I'm Keenan Loader, the editor-in-chief of volume 86 of the Albany Law Review. We appreciate you all taking the time to attend and join in on this fascinating conversation about sex work. Before I introduce you all to Albany Law Review's executive editor for Symposium, Julia Berry-Lopez, I'd like to take a little time to introduce you to the Law Review itself. So we are one of 3 journals at Albany Law School, the others being Government Law Review and the Journal of Science and Technology. Albany Law Review was founded in 1936 and is the successor to the Albany Law School Journal, which is the first student-edited legal periodical in the United States. We are an independent student-run journal with about 55 student editors that work tirelessly to edit articles that fill our 4 issues. Some of those topics include New York appeals, state constitutional commentary, and miscarriages of justice. I would now like to turn it over to Julia Berry-Lopez, whose continued effort has made this event possible.
Thank you, Keenan. And thank you all for being here at our Albany Law Review 2022 Symposium. It's been such an honor for me to be able to work on organizing this important discussion. And also we're very lucky to have our moderator, Professor Breger, who's a President William McKinley Distinguished Professor of Law. Professor Breger has been teaching for more than 20 years, and over which time she's earned numerous teaching and service awards, both on the national and local levels. There are too many to name here, but they include the Howard A. Levine Award for Excellence in Juvenile Justice and Child Welfare, bless you. The Nora C. Gilbert Award for the from the American Association of Law Schools, the L. Hart Wright Excellence in Law Teaching Award from the University of Michigan Law School, the Albany County Family Court Children's Center Award, and multiple awards from the Albany Law School. Professor Breger is also the co-author of the New York Law of Domestic Violence, which is a 2-volume treatise published by Reuters' Thompson West, as well as an author of numerous law review articles regarding issues of family law, gender injustice, and the increasing epidemic of child sex trafficking. She served as director of the Family Violence Litigation Clinic from 2002 to 2010. And prior to teaching, Professor Breger dedicated her career to children, women, and families, with her formative years practicing in New York City in numerous capacities. So without further ado, I will turn it over to her very capable hands. And also, we just had the air con turned on, so it should get
Good afternoon. Thank you for that introduction, Julia, and thank you for putting together this what's going to be a terrific intellectual debate this afternoon. The issue of sex work is often the basis of great debate. Scholars on every side of the fence passionately argue the issue, not always agreeing. Practitioners and sex workers fiercely support their positions. And almost everyone has an opinion in some way about what is right and what is wrong when it comes to sex work and how. At times, groups can't even agree on a terminology or common vocabulary. And that's one of the things we might talk about today in our Q&A. Yet on both sides of the aisles, advocates would say that they're fighting for human rights. Right. And so they would say that their position is the position that supports human rights, regardless of the position. And many might even call themselves feminists on both sides of the fence. So how can it be that we're all united in this yearning for human rights, but we disagree on fundamental questions, such as what is consent? What is coercion? What is voluntary? What is sex positive? What is empowering? These are just some of the fascinating topics that we will discuss today. The issues of prostitution and sex trafficking and their often intersections and overlaps are frequently addressed at the UN and other prominent human rights groups addressing human dignity and choice. The Albany Law Review has brought together some of the leading voices in the New York field Symposium editor Julia Berry Lopez has worked diligently to bring together speakers from all sides of the debate. And I'm very excited to introduce everybody to you. I will introduce the speakers one at a time, and then we'll hear from that speaker. And then after all 4 speakers present, we will open up the panel to you all in the audience to see if you have any questions. And I have a couple tucked away too that I might have a chance to ask. So with that, let me first welcome the speaker to my right, Senator Salazar. Senator Julia Salazar represents New York's 18th State Senate District, covering 7 Brooklyn neighborhoods. Prior to her election to the state Senate, she worked as a community organizer in New York City, beginning her advocacy as a student at Columbia University, where she fought for the rights of tenants and service industry workers, and later served with the group Jews for Racial and Economic Justice. And in 2018, Senator Salazar became the youngest woman elected in the history of the New York State Senate, as well as the first member of the Democratic Socialists of America to serve in the New York legislature. Senator Salazar currently chairs the state Senate's State Senate's Committee on Crime Victims, Crime and Correction, and serves as a member on other committees as well. She has attracted national media attention for her support of sex workers' rights, and she sponsored Senate Bill S-3075, which would have decriminalized certain prostitution offenses and amended provisions relating to the prosecution of such offenses and vacated judgments. So with that, Senator, you can either speak from here or here, whichever you prefer. We'd love to hear from you.
Great. Thank you so much, Professor Breger. And thank you all for being here with us today. Want to start by saying I deeply appreciate the opportunity to do this from the Albany Law Review, and also the work and contributions of my fellow panelists. Really excited to learn from you. I think we have some common goals when it comes to public health and public policy, and people who are affected by trafficking and the sex industry. So I will really focus on the legislation that we introduced to decriminalize sex work in New York State, and begin by saying that it's my perspective as a legislator that we have to legislate for the outcomes that we want to see, and that we can reasonably expect will result from a given policy. That is the essential idea that leads me to support the decriminalization as opposed to, I'll say, prohibition of sex work or legalization for that matter. And it's the essential idea that informs various harm reduction policies in response to public health issues. So I think that in this legislation and in this conversation, the public health issues that we're really seeking to address are the safety of all people who participate in the sex industry, people who purchase sex, sell sex, who trade sex, sex trafficking and sex crimes, mass incarceration and the impacts of criminalization on the people who are disproportionately impacted, as well as discriminatory enforcement of the existing law. I advocate for decriminalization because I think that decriminalization addresses each of these public health issues more effectively than prohibition, the status quo, or the legalization of sex work does. And I can explain the distinction, what I mean with decriminalization versus legalization. But first, to start with what this bill does. New York state law contains over a dozen criminal and civil provisions that punish adults who sell, or buy sex, as well as those who assist people who sell or buy sex, or who depend on them in some cases. For example, they may be providing housing to someone who works in the sex industry, or giving someone a ride to meet a client. Our bill, S3075, takes the decrim approach, supported by many organizations of sex workers or former sex workers, a broad coalition that has worked with us to draft the legislation and advocate for it. It repeals and amends various sections of Article 230 of the New York State Penal Law, all of which are related to sex work, legally referred to as prostitution, effectively removing criminal penalties for the purchase, sale, or trading of sex between consenting adults. The bill also allows individuals who have previously been convicted of offenses that are repealed by the bill to vacate those judgments of conviction. This would enable many sex workers and former sex workers to access housing, health and economic resources that are currently off limits to them or very difficult for them to access because of criminal records. Record relief would also allow people to more easily transition into other employment if they choose to, without the stigma and harassment that often is experienced when someone has a criminal record of prostitution convictions. What the bill does not do is alter the criminal and civil legal provisions under which individuals who engage in trafficking, coercion, sexual abuse, abuse of minors, or rape may be prosecuted, not affected by this bill, not amended, not repealed. But when the law differentiates between sex work between consenting adults and situations where a party does not consent, or that similarly involves minors who are not capable of consent, sex workers typically have an increased ability to report abuse, rape, theft, and crimes that are perpetrated against them that today go ignored or are difficult for sex workers, people in the sex industry to report. Criminalizing sex work really jeopardizes a means of survival for people, and particularly marginalized individuals. It has made LGBTQ individuals, we know it's certainly the case in New York, especially vulnerable to harassment and arrests based on gender expression, their sexuality, their appearance. The state legislature did repeal the statute that was colloquially known as the walking while trans statute, or loitering for the purpose of prostitution, which I think was a very important step toward minimizing the discriminatory enforcement of some components of the criminalization of prostitution. But there is much more that we can do. And I think that passing this legislation would be an additional step in the right direction. Also, criminalization, of course, has collateral consequences for immigrant sex workers and individuals whose immigration status could make them more vulnerable. Criminalization leads sex workers into the shadows in an environment where sex workers face increased violence, abuse, exploitation. They are more vulnerable to trafficking than they would be if they could work without fear of legal consequences. This is the perspective of those of us advocating for full decriminalization of sex work. It has been fully decriminalized for some time in New Zealand, also in New South Wales, and studies, reports that assess the impacts of this in New Zealand have shown that 90% of sex workers believe decriminalization has improved their employment and their legal rights. 60% of sex workers stated that decriminalization enabled them to more easily screen and potentially refuse dangerous clients. And they also have reported increased access to condoms and increased use of condoms in their work. Adversely, in 2016, France implemented the what some have called the end demand model. Sometimes it is referred to as the Nordic model, which redefined the criminalization of sex work so that arrests and prosecution of sex workers wouldn't continue, but maintaining criminal consequences for patronizing or promoting sex work. And as a result, research in France showed that 63% of sex workers reported worse living conditions after this change in the law, this redefining of the criminalization, and 42% reported increased workplace violence. And so we can at least see with admittedly limited scope, we can compare the impacts on the lives of sex workers and people who are participating in the sex industry. When a system that is based on criminalization is dismantled, or we seek to do this, a two-step process typically follows. And I'm not just talking about sex work, but the decriminalization or dismantling of criminalization of other behaviors that are frequently criminalized. Typically, decriminalization is followed by some form of regulation or legalization, and criminal penalties are removed, regulations are imposed, and what matters is the nature of those regulations that are imposed after sex work, in this case, is decriminalized. The question is, do they unreasonably encumber sex workers and others in the sex industry, or do they enhance their rights, their health, and their safety? Instead of treating all people who participate in the sex industry as consenting adults as either criminals or victims or both, it's my belief that it's time for us to create a more nuanced legal approach to this industry. Sex workers want decriminalization so that they can work in a legal environment without fear of the police, without fear of reporting violence, and without the inability often to report trafficking when it affects their peers or when they witness it. This is the approach that has shown to reduce violence, police harassment, and the transmission of sexually transmitted diseases. The collateral consequences of sex work criminalization are clear. And I think that it's time for us to really thoughtfully consider decriminalization as what I believe will be the most effective approach in allowing us to more effectively address trafficking, and also for the rights and the livelihood of people who participate in the sex industry. Thank you.
Senator, thank you for your remarks. Thank you for your advocacy. And thank you for really clearly articulating that distinction between decriminalization 100% versus legalization and so on. So we'll talk more about that as we go. Our next speaker is Nora Cronin to my left, who is an adjunct professor at John Jay College of Criminal Justice. As an adjunct in the master's program in international criminal justice, Professor Cronin teaches courses on human trafficking, gender in the law, and public policy. She is a former assistant director of the Bureau of Refugee Services at the New York State Office of Temporary and Disability Assistance, where she held that position for more than 6 years. In that role, Professor Cronin was the state coordinator for the New York State response to the human trafficking program, providing training and technical assistance in that area statewide. After receiving her JD from St. John's University Law School, Professor Cronin worked as a senior assistant district attorney in Brooklyn, New York, and an Empire State Fellow at the Governor's Office of Public Safety. I should note that Professor Cronin also co-edited a terrific book about human trafficking. I was honored to have a chapter in that book, and there were some other Albany Law folks. The dean wrote the foreword, and there were some students now practicing, one as an ADA, who wrote a chapter as well. So we're excited to welcome her back to Albany. And with that, Professor Cronin.
Thank you so much. Mentioning the students makes me feel both really proud and really old. So thank you so much for reminding me of that. So I am going to give you a little bit of a preview of what I do with my John Jay students on the first class, because I do want to talk about sex trafficking as it relates to how we observe, how we think about sex work, and how we work with the issue of people who are being trafficked within the sex work industry. So for those of you who may not know, as we'll talk about this over the course of the next couple of hours, human trafficking was not a crime in the United States until 2000. It wasn't recognized as a federal crime until the TVPA in 2000, which has since been reauthorized by Congress. And it was not in the penal code in New York State until 2007. So it's a very relatively new area of law. And because of that, I think there are opportunities for us to consider the laws as they were written then, and consider how we want those laws to shape our society as we move forward. So I will ask you, so there's one of the questions that I always ask my students is how in New York State, where we're sitting right now, approximately how many victims of trafficking do you think that are reported in New York State are actually from New York State? Were born in New York State, or foreign born, or versus foreign born? So the answer that how many people think that it's like 10% and that the rest of the trafficking victims are foreign born or from another country?
Less.
No, you think it's less? You think that, so in other words, how many trafficking victims that are in New York State are reportedly from New York State?
I mean, I don't know the number, but if I were to, I would say 100 people.
So you think 100% of the victims are?
I know 100 people.
Oh, okay. Well, there's a lot more.
Okay, but I don't know what percentage that would be in.
So yes, Blue Blazer.
I actually think it's significantly more than foreign born because most human trafficking victims are usually residing within the place, I feel like.
Where they report.
They would, yeah.
Right. So historically, I will say from my time with New York State OTDA, it's about 60% of the people who are reported as trafficking victims are from New York State, were born and raised in New York State. And you know, one of the myths that I try to explain to my students about trafficking is that a lot of people believe wrongly that you have to actually be trafficked, you have to come from another place to be in where you are by your trafficker. So with that being said as a premise, the fact that a lot of trafficking victims are actually native to where they are being trafficked, a lot of times traffickers have power because they traffic within their own communities and they prey on the vulnerabilities that people in their community have. You know, I think that is really important to consider how we approach the situation of trafficking and sex work, because if we are working with members of our own community and folks that, you know, may not have access to resources that we, you know, should be providing to these folks, then I think it's incumbent upon us to allocate funding to victim services. I noticed in the introduction, we talked a little bit about terminology. One of the things that we always seem to have a discussion over in this field is whether or not we call somebody a victim or a survivor. It's a really interesting debate, and I always, because I come from a prosecutorial background, I have this tendency to call people victims, and I don't mean to take away somebody's agency when I do that. I know the preferred term is survivor, but interestingly, when I was working for the state, I also used to call people victims because I had this tendency to think, well, if people start being referred to as survivors, they've survived. And victims to me are folks that still are in need of assistance and need help. And so because of that, we were in the position to advocate the legislature to have additional funding allocated to what we called quote unquote victim services. I noticed the center also sits on the crime victims court, so we still use this term. So how do we integrate that philosophy of giving folks agency while at the same time providing them with much needed services? My main concern with having sex work decriminalized in New York and in the United States in general is that I'm nervous that this is going to lead to the belief that their resources are no longer needed to be allocated to address the very vulnerabilities that these are members of our community are facing. There's poverty reduction that needs to be done. There are folks that are in dire need of employment, of childcare assistance, of healthcare assistance that are not receiving those. And because they're not receiving those, then they are looking to folks who can provide them with homes, with shelter, with healthcare. And those folks can sometimes be traffickers. One of the sadder stories that we hear a lot in anti-trafficking work is, the person who is reached out to over social media, over the internet a lot of times, and they become taken in by somebody who is approaching them as a friend. A lot of times we even see this happen in the LGBTQ community, where somebody who feels abandoned by their parents can then, find a group of friends online that they believe will take care of them. And then what happens when that person then says to them, well, we need to pay rent this month, so can you help me out by doing sex work for me? And a lot of times the person says yes. And maybe there's nothing wrong with that choice morally. That's up to a person's own beliefs to decide. But how do we prevent that from being a forced choice? I think those are questions that are really important. One other point that I wanted to make about the history of human trafficking in New York State is regarding human trafficking intervention courts, because this was sort of an interesting experiment that we had in order to, they were approached more as problem-solving courts, but what happened was they were, they became prostitution, they were called originally prostitution diversion courts, and then they became human trafficking intervention courts, because I believe the idea was that if you were arrested for crime of prostitution, then ideally what would happen is after receiving services which were court mandated, then you might be able to participate with the prosecution, of course, in the prosecution of a trafficker. But what these courts ended up becoming is more of a service-oriented court. It didn't actually result in a lot of prosecutions of traffickers, by the way. In fact, I was looking online, and there are extremely low numbers of prosecutions of traffickers actually in the United States in general. And I think there was like 200 cases in like the entire United States of people actually being prosecuted for trafficking, which is a question, of maybe why there's risk-averse prosecutions. Prosecutors tend to be risk-averse when taking on these types of cases. They also require a lot of work. So, one of the issues that we wanted to work with making human trafficking intervention courts, that model sustainable, it was a lot of ways that people came into services. And unfortunately, that meant that person who came into services had to go through the system. And as I'm sure somebody from legal aid will address, going through the system presents its own harm. And even if we, even if we have vacatur laws, which were important developments, because it did do things like allow people to have clear criminal histories, so they could apply for additional employment opportunities, educational opportunities, public assistance opportunities. It still left folks without, with this trauma of going through a criminal justice system and having a criminal justice exposure. And so I think that is something that we would have to look at and remedy if we were to get rid of any types of violations or crimes for prostitution, because we would have to figure out a way to get services to people who need them the most. And then one other point that I wanted to bring up, because I do teach in an international program, in areas where prostitution has been, or sex work has been decriminalized, the results aren't as clear cut because people who tend to respond to surveys about their likelihood of success are people who actually are successful, people who have benefited from the reduction or the decriminalization, whereas people who are still being trafficked are not accessible to researchers. They're not accessible to law enforcement. In fact, prostitution has been decriminalized in Canada, and the research there suggests that there have been a lack of law enforcement interventions and trafficking prosecutions. So I'm curious to know what would happen in the United States, where we have, and in New York State in particular, where we have very few prosecutions of traffickers already. That number would likely fall even more. And what that would tend to do is empower folks who are empowered in areas like Holland or areas like New Zealand, who are working out with criminal organizations to exploit really the most vulnerable of the population of those countries and those who can't really respond to additional interventions because they are among the countries already most vulnerable. My students always ask me, like, where do you stand on the issue? And the answer is, I really don't know, because I think that we have to continue to look at data and continue to, read critically reports and studies and pieces of legislation to look for the most possible outcome. As somebody who believes in women's rights and as a feminist, like, I want to make sure that there are options for the most vulnerable women in our society, because if we don't create opportunities for the most vulnerable, I think that is really doing a disservice to us as public service workers.
Thank you very much. And thanks for educating us today about sort of the scope of trafficking in our own communities, which is often an overlooked fact. So thank you for raising that. Our next speaker couldn't be here today, but is here on camera on Zoom. We have RJ Thompson, Managing Director of the Sex Workers Project at the Urban Justice Center. RJ Thompson Rodriguez, seeing his name, adding a name, is a longtime human rights lawyer, organizer, and educator, as well as a certified personal trainer, go-go dancer, and performer in the adult film industry. Prior to joining the Sex Workers Project as managing director, he worked as the Fair Courts Project community educator at Lambda Legal, where he trained judges, attorneys, and court staff on gender and sexuality, cultural competency, and advocated for judicial diversity and judicial independence in Arizona, Texas, Florida, and the federal bench. He received his JD from CUNY Law School and his BA in Africana Studies and Political Science from the University of South Florida. He's held a myriad of advocacy leadership roles, fighting from everything from increased wages and healthcare for restaurant workers to reproductive justice to LGBT movements. RJ Thompson also fought for human rights of sex workers during the first United Nations Universal Periodic Review of the United States. He describes himself as, quote, a queer identified mixed blood Cherokee with deep Southern roots. So we are very excited to hear from you today. Take it away.
Thank you so much, everyone. I first of all want to apologize for not being able to be in Albany today. There were several factors that led to the last minute change to doing this virtually. So I'm disappointed to not be there with you all, but very excited to be part of the symposium. Can folks hear me okay?
I'm trying to just adjust it. I'm having a little hard time, so let me just adjust it, but go ahead. I'll do that in the background.
Yeah, I always want to check because sometimes you don't know. Should I continue?
That adjusts the mic. Do you want me to adjust it real quick?
Okay, adjust it on Zoom.
You have to adjust it.
Okay.
Thank you.
I can adjust it on Zoom if it's just.
Yeah, you gotta go audio settings right here. And then.
There we go. Thank you. All right. Okay, let's try again. Continue on. Thank you.
One more reason why I wish I was there in person, but thanks for bearing with me. So first I want to thank the organizers of this symposium, Julia Barry Lopez, I want to say, after having worked with many, many students and done many dozens of lectures at many schools, is one of the kindest, most patient people I've worked with to organize something like this. So thank you so much, Julia. I also want to thank all of my co-panelists and particularly Senator Salazar, who has been a champion for people in the sex trades for such a long time, who has stood with us when she did not have to, and has continued to be in solidarity with workers in many, many ways. So thank you, Senator Salazar. I also want to say that while I fervently advocate for full decriminalization, there are many things that Professor Cronin has said that I absolutely agree with. I think we have a lot of points in commonality, which was also expressed in the introduction. And I think it's important to say, again, that while we may have different approaches, I think that we do have shared common ground around human rights and feminism. So as was said in the introduction, it's important for me to have people know that I identify as a pansexual queer person, as a feminist and indigenous man, and also that I have worked in the sex trades for about 25, 26 years. I've been a human rights lawyer since 2005, but I've worked in the sex trades prior to, during, and after law school. And not only as a go-go dancer, stripper, and adult film performer, but also doing full service work for many years, escorting, which is currently criminalized in New York and across this country. So my comments today are as a directly impacted person from my direct lived experience, as well as an advocate. It's a both and for me. So I am the managing director of the Sex Workers Project of the Urban Justice Center for the past 5 years. Some of you may be familiar with the Urban Justice Center, which has a domestic violence project, mental health project. We have 8 different anchor projects in one, and the Sex Workers Project has been around for 21 years now. We provide direct legal services. We're one of the only organizations in the country to do so for sex workers specifically, as well as survivors of human trafficking. And we take the approach in doing that of meeting people where they are, doing trauma-informed and holistic client-centered lawyering with clients for the past 21 years who fall somewhere on a spectrum of choice, circumstance, or coercion. Many of our clients have been both human trafficking survivors and have done consensual sex work at different points in their lives. So the idea, which some perpetuate, that trafficking survivors and sex workers are always 2 different groups of people is not true. Often those 2 experiences overlap and intersect in the same person's life. Much like people in other labor sectors experience positive experiences in their job and also experience worker exploitation of many types. So I think, when we talk about sex work as work, we also need to understand the ways in which sex work and the sex trades are like other industries and other labor sectors, especially those impacting low-income people, migrant people, like domestic workers, farm workers, restaurant workers. There are so many intersections. At SWP, in addition to providing free legal services for sex workers and trafficking survivors, we also engage in policy advocacy at the local, state, and federal level, as well as international mechanisms like the UPR that was talked about in my intro. And we do original research for the past 20 years, including research on the human trafficking intervention courts that we did with Yale. You can find all of our reports on our website. And we're the only sex worker-led organization doing original research, participatory action research, and academic research in the country. And lastly, our 4th programmatic area is education. So talks like this, but also we have a cutting-edge documentary series that humanizes sex workers as parents, as family members, how criminalization harms our family members, and as people who provide valuable needed services in society, including things like end-of-life care, that you never hear about. So it's very important for us to talk about sex work in an expansive way and emphasize that no one's experience in the sex trades, that there are as many experiences in the sex trades as there are people in the sex trades, and not to try to make us a monolithic group or put us in often binary categorizations that don't reflect lived realities. So, there is a reason why Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, Lambda Legal, the National Center for Transgender Equality, and important Freedom Network USA, the largest trafficking survivor network and anti-trafficking network in this country, and Global Alliance Against Trafficking in Women, all strongly support full decriminalization of adult consensual sex work and do not support prohibitionist and demand Nordic models. There are many reasons why that is, and I'm going to go over some of them. For one, prohibitionist models, as Senator Salazar has rightly called them, are paternalistic and often deeply rooted in white savior missionary complexes. And that's not to say that the only proponents of them are white, as BIPOC people have internalized those complexes as well, but the tendency for white liberals to be paternalistic and missionary in their approach to many human rights issues is a deep problem, not only in this movement, but in many movements, and certainly in the sex worker rights movement. One way to combat that is that, are we good? Audio, yeah? Is that better? Did you not hear anything I said yet? I cannot hear anybody.
Okay, there we go. So we were able to hear you so far, but of course it'll be much easier now.
You were or were not?
We were. Yes.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for fixing that. All right, so one way to combat this paternalism and missionary or savior complex is to have public policy be informed, truly informed, by those that are directly impacted. We often hear this, organizations say this, but it needs to be made real. And that means that it cannot be only legislators, academics, or well-intentioned allies creating policy that impacts people's lives. And this is not only in the area of sex work, but in really any area of public policy that impacts human rights and social justice and people's lived experience, particularly when it comes to criminalization that has such a deep and broad set of collateral consequences that impact people for the rest of their lives around education, housing, travel, voting in many places, and so forth. So, we see this paternalism come up again and again, including by people who call themselves feminists, who don't seem to believe in feminist concepts of bodily autonomy, choice, or seem to think that some people are not able to make choice. The term forced choice, which came up already today, there is no such thing as forced choice. At the Sex Workers Project, we believe if something is forced or coerced, it is certainly not a choice. And we're very clear on the difference between work and exploitation. And that, to call something a forced choice really shows a deeply ingrained belief that certain people, often BIPOC people, young people, people who use drugs, trans people, poor people, for some reason cannot make their own choices about their own lives. And so then you have this missionary savior complex come into play. We also cannot fight human rights abuses with other human rights abuses. Unfortunately, this country tries to do that very often. The criminal punishment system, the criminal legal system in this country, as I'm sure most of you know, is rife with human rights abuses. In fact, I would go so far as to say that the US is a rogue nation state in many ways when it comes to human rights, and other nation states around the world see us as such in many contexts. And so we try to build a human rights culture, those of us who are human rights lawyers focused on domestic implementation and domestic issues in the US, to change that culture in the US that is focused on services, charities, benefits, seeing things like education, healthcare, housing, right to work as anything but human rights. That is an intentional part of our culture in the United States that comes about from post-World War II, 1940s and 50s, intentional ignoring of economic and social rights. It is not an accident. It comes from anti-socialist notions, the Red Scare, and there's a book called Eyes Off the Prize by Dr. Carol Anderson that I highly recommend if people want to understand why the United States refuses to recognize things like work and housing and health and education as rights rather than services, charities, or benefits. The US criminal punishment system is an example of how we are a rogue nation when it comes to human rights. The criminal punishment system is a human rights catastrophe in the United States, based on the numbers of people who are incarcerated, the numbers of people who have lifelong collateral consequences, things that should never have been criminalized in the first place, including cannabis, sex work, and many, many other things. And so to further criminalize or keep certain aspects of criminalization on clients, on managers, on people who help us as sex workers survive and thrive in our work and in our daily lives is problematic, to say the least. And I would say is white supremacist as well. And the reason I say that is because any criminal punishment solution in this country, it is a fact, targets Black, Indigenous, people of color, BIPOC people, and poor people, and often migrants, and often trans and gender nonconforming people. Criminal punishment solutions to public policy are rooted in being punitive rather than being proactive in addressing root issues at their core. So, for example, under the Nordic or in-demand or prohibitionist or so-called equality model, no idea what they call it that, it's anything but about equality, is the fact that it is not mostly white men that would be criminalized on these public policy scenarios. It is not currently mostly white or wealthy men who are criminalized as buyers or customers or clients. Most of our legal services clients at the Sex Workers Project of the Urban Justice Center, over 21 years of experience, are people doing survival-based, street-based sex work often, and their clients or customers are intra-community. And so this sort of pretty woman notion that it is usually powerful, wealthy, and or white men coming in and taking advantage of sex workers, while sometimes true, is not often true. And often people are doing survival-based sex work intra-community. And what that means is criminalizing buyers or clients or customers, as well as managers, simply shifts the focus of criminalization from workers who are BIPOC, who are migrant, who are trans, to people within our same communities who are trading something of value for sexual, erotic, or companionship services. So there is a deeply racist and classist, automatic, really, aspect of enforcement of any criminal punishment policy. That should be well settled. Unfortunately, people will still try to deny that, but it is fact. Also, there's a notion that is perpetuated that sex workers and survivors of trafficking, as I said before, are always two different and often posed as oppositional groups of people. That we know is not true, because our clients and our friends and our colleagues, many of them are people who have done sex work across that spectrum of choice, circumstance, and coercion at different points in their lives and in different situations. So it's important to not think in binary ways, which is really hard for us to do because we're all raised, almost all of us are raised to think in binary ways. We have to think in spectrums because life exists on spectrums. Life exists in the gray. And it's very hard when trying to create public policy to think in the gray, but we have to. We have to. There is no such thing as these binaries that are perpetuated as truths. Another binary that is not true is that sex workers and clients or customers or buyers are always two different groups of people. Many of us of all genders and all races and all socioeconomic backgrounds have been sex workers and purchasers of sexual services. This is almost never talked about. And so if a sex worker is also a buyer of sexual services, the same individual, are we victims or are we oppressors and people exploiting someone? So I would ask you to really think about what that means. If we are no longer going to be criminalized for selling sexual services, the same people can be criminalized for buying sexual services. And so this myth that we are protecting victims and punishing oppressors or exploiters is far too simplistic and does not address these overlaps and intersections that I'm naming. Also, men, including transgender men, cisgender men, non-binary people, people of many different genders, are almost completely invisibilized and not part of the dialogue and debate around sex work and human trafficking, despite the fact that there are many cisgender and transgender men and non-binary people, including on our staff, who are sex workers and who also have been survivors of trafficking. We have legal services clients who are transgender men, transgender women, cis men, cis women, people of all genders who are survivors of human trafficking. And I want to stress that, again, that this for us is always a both and. For 21 years, we have been an anti-trafficking organization. We're an anti-trafficking organization in a movement that pits sex worker rights against anti-trafficking. Many of us are both anti-trafficking advocates, and I don't know any sex worker or sex worker rights advocate who is pro-human trafficking. So this idea that we are sex workers or sex worker rights advocates are somehow promoting human trafficking or exacerbating vulnerabilities to trafficking is simply absurd. And it's in fact really, really offensive, frankly, to those of us who are sex workers and sex worker rights advocates that have committed years to combating human trafficking. And so this invisibilizing people of different genders in the sex trades is really problematic, and it usually comes from those second wave feminists who think very reductively about gender and often are the same people who have had anti-trans positions and policies for many years. I think it's critically important to note that when we see protests in New York City, when we first came out as the Decrim New York Coalition, we had people against SVSTA, the package decrim bill, and against even vacature expansion for survivors of trafficking, and against repealing walking while trans, who are notably the same organizations who have advocated for genitalia checks at events, no penis policies, anti-trans, violently anti-trans positions. And as we often say, if you are for transgender rights and the human rights of transgender people, you must be for the full decriminalization of sex work. And lastly, as I wrap up my comment, I just want to say once again that at the Sex Project of the Urban Justice Center and myself personally, we are interested in working with people who have differences of opinions, people of good faith who have differences of opinions about how to promote and protect the human rights of sex workers and trafficking survivors. However, we are staunchly opposed to expanding the criminal punishment system, which has severe white supremacist consequences. We are opposed to things that involve police and state violence solutions rather than community-based solutions from directly impacted people. And to the idea of how will we get services to the people who need them most? We've been doing that for 21 years at SWP without relying on criminal prosecution, policing, or state violence. We do that through building trusted relationships with community partners, with other sex workers, and through that, we are able to identify people most vulnerable to trafficking and provide services to people who actually want them, rather than coercive services that are mandated by so-called problem-solving courts that are really just one step removed from traditional courts in their approach to being coercive towards people who appear before them. Thank you.
Thank you, RJ, for bringing up some really thought-provoking material, for reminding us not to see sex work in binary or monolithic terms. And great point about sex workers often being sex buyers and vice versa. Both you and Senator Salazar also address collateral consequences of criminalization, which is such an important point that is often lost as well. So thank you for that. We will hear from our final speaker today, Damara Fredette, Legal Aid Society of Northeastern New York. Damara graduated from this fine law school cum laude in 2019. She was a pro bono scholar and government law center fellow. During law school, she became involved in the plight of victims of sex trafficking, becoming co-chair of the Sex Trafficking Committee with the Women's Bar Association of the state of New York, which she still is doing. Through her work in the committee, she lobbies for legislation supporting victims of trafficking, including support for New York's proposed Sex Trafficking Survivors Justice and Equality Act. Damara is a staff attorney with Legal Aid Society, working with clients who are facing housing and employment discrimination based on prior involvement with the criminal justice system. So it fits in right with what you're saying. I should also note that Damara worked closely with me on a terrific paper about sex trafficking for her upper level writing requirement before she graduated. So it's really nice to see her back on the panel. Go ahead and present your remarks for us.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me?
On my end, there's no audio.
So again, I'm wearing the hat of my co-chair position. Thank you everyone for attending. Thank you to my other panelists. Thank you to Julia for inviting me. I did have some things prepared that every other panelist has covered, so I'll try to unpractice and skim over some things. I may add some things, but what I'm here today is to present some definitions, data, statistics, examples of sex trafficking and the commercial sex trade, as well as a little bit of a discussion on the federal and New York State legislative responses to trafficking. So I want to start with some definitions. Sanctuary for families defines sex trafficking as a form of modern day slavery involving the recruitment, transportation, transfer, harboring, or receipt of persons by means of threat or use of force or other forms of coercion, or of the abuse of power or of a position of vulnerability for purposes of commercial sexual exploitation. Sanctuary for Families reports that the estimated amount of money spent with trafficking is $150 billion worldwide. According to World Without Exploitation, the sex trade, fueled in part by human trafficking, is a crisis that exists globally, including the United States. The sex trade is a market for acts of prostitution in which buyers, mostly white men, pay for sexual access to the bodies of other persons, mostly women and girls, with money or other things of value. Now, knowing that buyers tend to target vulnerable populations, things of value doesn't always mean money. It can mean housing, food, drugs, if someone is addicted, any sorts of things that are of value for that vulnerable person. This trade takes place in numerous venues: brothels, illicit massage parlors, escort services, hotels, private residences, bars, on the streets, and in strip and adult clubs. This sex trade exists in nearly every region across the globe, and it is as profitable as drug and weapons trafficking. In 2015, where there were 1,220 cases of human trafficking reported to state law enforcement agencies, 81% were commercially sex trafficked. The average age of a person entering the sex trade is 14. And another study has shown that there are girls as young as 11 being forced into this sex trade. 92% of trafficked women report being subjected to physical violence shot, strangled, burned, beaten, stabbed, punched. 43% of sex buyers in a 2015 Chicago study believe that if a man pays for sex, the woman should do anything they ask. 47% of prostituted women in that same Chicago study reported being raped by both pimps and their buyers. Polaris Project reminds us that sex trafficking is not something you can see happening across a crowded room. It's not a crime that occurs in an instant, like a kidnapping or carjacking, that a bystander witnesses and then can immediately report. In fact, many people in active sex trafficking situations do not recognize themselves that they are being victims, because they have been expertly groomed by a trafficker to believe that they have chosen to participate in commercial sex. And as a reminder, I believe Senator Salazar said this as well, trafficking does not mean you're moving people. This is not a thing where there's some transporting involved necessarily. Sex trafficking can take place in your own home. Many victims are trafficked by their own family members, community members, religious organizations, place of employment. There does not need to be an actual movement going on. One example Professor Cronin used that I was going to use is just a basic, common, everyday man and woman meet online or they meet at a party. They begin communicating after they get their first meeting. The man says, you know, he starts paying a lot of attention to her. She's vulnerable. She says, wow, he's so supportive. He listens to me. We always see each other. He maybe begins to buy her gifts. And says, you know, this is because I care about you so much. And then maybe one night he says to her, hey, let's go out. Let's go to my friend's house. I want you to be nice to my friends. She goes with him. Again, this has been going on. There's some grooming going on. He may buy her an expensive gift if she was nice to his friends. After that, the parties may be more frequent. She's asked again and again to be nice to his friends, comply with his friends' requests. If there's money exchanging hands, it's going right to the man, not to the woman. And he will, justify that he's saving up, he'll keep the money, he's going to buy them a big house someday. This is all for her benefit. She continues to comply with the understanding she's getting, he's looking out for her, he's doing things for her benefit. One night she decides maybe she doesn't want to go to the party, she isn't feeling well, she's tired. And that's when she sees the man's true intentions. He becomes enraged, physically violent, threatens her. And now, of course, she's trapped. She may have moved in with him. He has all of the money. He may help her care for her children if she has some. So that's just a common, everyday, perfect example of how that would be. Maybe other people would think that's boyfriend girlfriend situation, but it's much more than that, and there's a lot more of the coercion going on. I wanted to talk about some famous cases that we have. Unfortunately, all were here in New York. Jeffrey Epstein, everyone knows that case. Few years prior to that, there was Jared Fogle. He was a former Subway sandwich spokesperson. While he was not ever convicted of sex trafficking, he did pay to have sex with minor girls in hotels in New York City, including the Ritz-Carlton and the Plaza. So we're not talking about this going on in a shady, sketchy part of town. We're talking about in plain view in a very elitist part of New York City. Another one you may or may not have heard of, Keith Rainier. He was trafficking women from the capital region, actually the county that I live in, adult women going to yoga and being told, oh, I'm going to start this great women's empowerment group called Nexium. Many of his victims were branded. They had nude photos taken of them, and that was help used to hold them, in his grasp. They were at his beck and call. They had pagers. So again, and we're talking adult women. The most recent one is Larry Ray. I don't know if anyone has seen the Netflix special. He was just recently convicted. Larry Ray was released from a New York prison and began living with his adult daughter, who attended Sarah Lawrence College. He just started crashing on her couch and slowly worked to grooming her inner circle of friends. Convinced one woman to, to become prostituting for him. He made tens of thousands of dollars just on the one victim. He was also convicted of labor trafficking. He took these adults to his North Carolina property. They were digging trenches, doing landscaping, planting, and building fences. Just again, prime examples of sex and labor trafficking. And again, I believe he was convicted just this last March. So again, you can see it at a small scale. You can see it on a bigger scale. High profile cases. And again, just one-on-one interactions. Trafficking can occur everywhere. I want to turn now to federal legislation. As again, my co-panelists have mentioned, in the year 2000, Congress enacted what's called the TVPA, or the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, recognizing that trafficking is a pervasive, pernicious criminal enterprise that's going on not only in the United States, but globally. TVPA defines human trafficking as a crime involving the exploitation of someone for the purpose of compelled labor or a commercial sex act through the use of force, fraud, or coercion. A commercial sex act means any sex act on account of which anything of value is given to or received by any person. Where a person younger than 18 is induced to perform a commercial sex act, it is a crime regardless of whether there is force, fraud, or coercion. The actions that are involved in that federal statute include recruiting, harboring, transporting, providing, obtaining, patronizing, soliciting, and advertising. Again, as my panelists have said, there have been some tweaks, some modifications. In 2003, the TVPRA, which is the Protections Reauthorization Act, introduced a civil cause of action for victims. So victims can then sue their traffickers. And it also added that trafficking is recognized that trafficking is a crime under RICO statute. So if you're not familiar with RICO, it's racketeering, influenced, corrupt organizations. So again, recognizing that trafficking is a criminal enterprise as a crime. Also in the year 2000, the United Nations introduced the Palermo Protocols, recognizing again, this is an international criminal enterprise. It was to supplement the Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime. The protocols include the protocol to prevent, suppress, and punish trafficking in persons, especially women and girls, and the protocol against the smuggling of migrants by land, sea, and air. I just want to give you a very brief 1-year statistics. This is coming from the Department of Justice's Bureau of Justice Statistics. I'm actually on their emailing list, so I get their statistics regularly from their human trafficking data collections activities. For the fiscal year 2020, for those charged with human trafficking offenses, 92% were male, 63% were white, 95% were US citizens, and 66% had no prior criminal convictions. Of the 208 defendants charged with peonage, slavery, forced labor, and sex trafficking, 78% were male and 50% were Black. And of the 529 defendants charged with sexual exploitation and other abuse of children, 93% were male and 72% were white. At the federal level, with victims who have been identified as, or persons who have been identified as victims of trafficking, whether sex or labor, and they are from another country, they're possibly undocumented. They have an option, it's called a T visa or a T non-immigrant status visa. For those who are considered eligible, again, you can just be deemed a victim of trafficking and you're not from the United States. With that T visa, it gives those victims a temporary immigration benefit that enables victims of severe forms of trafficking in persons to remain in the US for an initial period of up to 4 years if they comply with a reasonable request for assistance with law enforcement in the detection, investigation, or prosecution of their trafficker or traffickers. With that T visa, it's merely a form. It's called I-194. the victim fills out the form, includes a personal statement discussing their time, their experience as a trafficked victim, and that includes the evidence of their compliance with working with law enforcement. In addition, those victims at the federal level are eligible for resources. They have similar resources at the state level, but again, we're talking public assistance, housing, food stamps, medical care. So I want to move on to New York's response. In 2008, New York passed the first state of the nation to pass the Safe Harbor for Exploited Children Act, more commonly known as Safe Harbor Law, to end the prosecution of minors under prostitution charges, instead identifying them as victims and not as perpetrators of crime. New York was the first state, as I said, and OCFS, Office of Children and Family Services, as well as OTDA, Professor Cronin mentioned, those are the agencies directly involved with providing minors with victims with services such as, again, public assistance, housing, food stamps, SNAP, medical care, those services that they need. As of 2022, there are now 9 states with safe harbor legislation. And I would like to add, I didn't put this in my notes, but there are concerns that due to more recent Supreme Court decisions, some of those provisions of safe harbor laws, particularly with medical care for victims, may be at risk. In 2010, New York legislation added a subsection to Criminal Procedure Law 44010. Again, I believe Senator Salazar and Professor Cronin mentioned 44010. In New York's Criminal Procedure Law 44010 is basically it's a motion you file with a sentencing court, a sentencing judge, asking that judge to vacate or completely eliminate a conviction based on, there's several subsections. It can be a Sixth Amendment violation. It can be that there's new exculpatory evidence. The person didn't understand their plea. There are several factors that, or several reasons that you can apply for a vacatur. In 2010, New York added the subsection I, which is for victims of trafficking. I've actually done a few of these, they're pretty lengthy, but it's a 44010. You go to the sentencing court, you present that motion. It is a motion, just like a motion to dismiss, a motion to suppress. And you also present that motion, of course, to it. The DA's office, very recently, Governor Hochul signed what's called the START Act, which actually allows victims to vacate any conviction based on their time as a traffic victim. So we're talking weapons charges, drug possession, assaults, things like that. But when in 2010, when that subsection I first was enacted, it was merely you could apply to have your prostitution related offenses vacated. And for a lot of trafficking victims, they may have more than just prostitution charge. They may have, a lot of them carry knives, they carry guns, they carry box cutters. And those are other charges that my favorite judge, Toko Sarita, recognized well before the START Act, that she would have victims coming to her court with their vacatur motions, and she was vacating pretty much any charge, so long as someone could show that they were a victim of trafficking. As I mentioned, the START Act was just passed by signed by Governor Hochul, and that again includes all any conviction, so long as you're deemed a victim of trafficking. And then again, all my co-panelists mentioned the walking while trans that has been repealed, Penal Law 24037, that was huge for, again, most victims, most persons who are arrested by law enforcement are marginalized, people of marginalized communities, BIPOC, women, trans, LGBTQ. So again, law enforcement is targeting them. They have the highest number of arrests with that charge of loitering for the purpose of prostitution. So repealing that has been a step in the right direction. And again, Women's State Bar does support the passage of the Equality Act, the Sex Trade Survivors, Justice Survivors and Equality Act. It is a combination of decriminalizing prostitution and any forms of, well, I'll say decriminalizing prostitution, but the additional piece is penalizing those that have a demand, that demand the sex work. It's targeting sex buyers, pimps, any other third parties that are, in our view, continuing to keep trafficking victims. Again, we recognize that decriminalizing is a step in the right direction. We do know that data shows that merely decriminalizing prostitution does not decrease trafficking. It does not eliminate trafficking. In fact, there's a 2012 study from the London School of Economics that showed where decriminalization was enacted, trafficking actually increased. So again, with my hat as the Women's State Bar, we do support the passage of the equality model. Thank you.
Thank you for reminding us of the scope of the issue. And, both you and RJ talked about invisibility in different ways, but it's such a prominent community in this area. Often groups feel invisible in many different ways. That reaches the conclusion of the formal remarks. And now we're going to open up the floor for questions from you. First, let's just give all of our speakers a nice round of applause. There are mics here if you want to come up and ask a question. I have a bunch of questions as well, but I'd rather open it up to the audience. So is there anybody out there who would like to ask any of the speakers or all of the speakers a question? Do you want to come to the mic or do you think you can say it from there? I can always repeat it.
Can I just say?
Yeah, and I'll try to repeat it.
First of all, thank you for hosting this event. Thank you for the panelists to share thoughts this dinner. I am on US visa almost for 10 years now. Every range from the traveler, tourist to student to employment. So I would particularly like to ask questions of foreign nationals or those who are undocumented and victims who are in very complex or difficult situations that they will really unlikely to report or reveal disclose their information on their status because of other fear of their locations or lack of consequences that are generally known to them. I did take note of some people that I never actually thought of it, but sure, but I guess my question is, when the victims are not even aware of these situations of the fact that they are trafficked, that there are some remedies out there for that. And some of them are non-English speakers, I assume. So I wonder what are the measures out there which is happening to assess this situation better or monitor these reports in a more coherent way, because I cannot really picture a situation where these victims actually voluntarily reveal or report to some local agency.
Okay, thank you so much. I want to just try to say it again, rephrase that. You tell me if I'm doing it accurately, right? And definitely Damara did talk about the idea that a lot of times those who are trafficked don't self-identify as being trafficked. They start to think that it is consensual. So I know you raised that. So I think what you're asking, tell me if I'm right, when victims are foreign nationals or undocumented and they're involved in complex or difficult situations where they might not feel comfortable revealing that they're being trafficked, what measures do we have to assess their situation in a more complete way?
Yeah, I wonder what are some other means out there than voluntarily reporting their situation for these complex and ambiguous situations for these victims.
Other means to report or to assess?
I guess both. I mean, I just don't see a situation where these people are inability. So many of them probably not able to really report their situation.
So how do these persons report, or how are they measured? How do we reach them? How do we assess them? Does anyone want to take that question?
Yeah, I would actually like to address it.
Okay, so
The,
Nora, and then I have RJ has his hand up, and you can go from there. Go ahead.
So very interestingly, in New York State, when the Bureau of Refugee Services, where I was formerly employed, has a program specifically for undocumented human trafficking victims. And it's extremely important that we don't ignore, funding, at the government level and to nonprofits that work in this area, because as I'm sure you're aware, public assistance is not accessible to folks who have no status in this country. So it can be really challenging to have to overcome a trafficking situation if the very means that you need to overcome it aren't available to you. So that's why it's so important that there's nonprofits out there that can serve victims and meet them where they are. And I do agree with RJ that I think peer-to-peer outreach and that those particular communities can be really effective. A lot of our referrals that we received at the Response to Human Trafficking program were made through peer-to-peer outreach or church groups, people who are working in the communities that they serve. So that can be really effective. I will also say that due to some ill-advised policies of the Trump administration, a lot of not undocumented folks were unable to come forward because they were afraid that they would be deported if they reported their trafficking to law enforcement. So those were at the times that we actually saw a reduction in cases among undocumented persons, which I don't think had to do with the fact that there was less trafficking of undocumented persons from the years 2016 to 2020. I think just had to do with the fear that folks would be deported if they were to report, which is why it's really important to be able to work with nonprofits that serve those communities.
Okay, let me turn to RJ.
Yeah, so this question is really on point to the legal services we provide day in and day out. I didn't mention, but our legal services for sex workers and trafficking survivors are centered for many years now on immigration and asylum legal services. So our legal team at the Sex Workers Project of the Urban Justice Center are sought out as national experts on the intersections of migration, human trafficking, and sex work. And we every day, every week, work on relief like T visas that was talked about a moment ago, asylum claims, sometimes under a Convention Against Torture, a particular social group, and we also work on adjustments of status, work permits, and other issues related to removal defense as well, and other issues related to migration and the sex trades. So, I want to really emphasize again that when it comes to all human relationships, we have to remember that people who are in vulnerable situations are usually going to be most forthcoming to people they trust. That is human nature, and most people do not trust, most people who are undocumented or marginalized in these different layers of marginalization, who know that there can be migration consequences, criminal consequences related to their situation, who may know that they are doing consensual or circumstance-based sex work, but may be identified as being trafficked, are not, their first trusted partners are not usually state agents. And also many of them see well-intentioned outreach workers, sometimes social workers, even as connected to or as agents of the state, even if they are not. And so that peer-to-peer referral network, community-based referral network, has always been deeply important for us to be able to identify who in the sex trades is vulnerable, most vulnerable to trafficking, and who may be caught in an overbroad net around stings and things like that that happen at massage venues and other places where people who are actually not being trafficked are identified as such. So in our experience, again, over 2 decades, those relationships with sex workers who are working often in close proximity to people who are vulnerable to or actually are being trafficked have been the most valuable partners to us in identifying who actually needs our services, and might be more forthcoming with those of us who take a trauma-informed and client-centered approach that meets people where they are, rather than a coercive or missionary type of approach that far too many social service providers and agents of the state employ. So that is number one for us, is community-based identification and peer-to-peer identification.
That makes a lot of sense. Damara, did you want to answer the question?
Yeah, I just wanted to add that in situations where you have undocumented traffic victims in places of business. Again, most of the time, you're not going to see all of the traffic victims come out and say, oh, yes, we've been trafficked. It's normally going to be, unfortunately, law enforcement or an agency come in. And again, you're still going to see the victims not identifying, oh, I work here, I give massages here, I dance here, whatever. You still can't get that point across to them. So while I recognize what RJ is saying, yeah, the last group they want to trust is an agency. Unfortunately, sometimes that's the first time we'll see detection of something that's illicit going on. But I think that getting the word out there, one of the projects we did with our sex trafficking committee was post flyers throughout New York State, subway stations, bathrooms, libraries, grocery stores, everywhere we could, in several languages. And just to make sure that people were aware, you may not even know you're a traffic victim, you're in the grocery store and you see a poster that, maybe resonates with what's going on with you. And there's a phone number and a text to call or contact. So I think it's also just making sure that it's out there everywhere, that you may not be in a situation that you should be in, that there's help for you.
Okay. Yes, go ahead and ask your question. Yeah, thanks for coming to the mic. Yes, easier.
So, anyone can answer this, but I was just kind of wondering in general, how would you guys walk the line between that advocacy for adults who have been trafficked as children, and then because that is the only life they've known, they end up going into sex work as adults? How do you walk that line when they say they aren't victims and you want to help, but you also don't want to take away their autonomy in defining what they are?
Great question. Did you were able to hear it, RJ? Great. Do you want to go ahead and take that first?
Yeah, my answer is going to be very brief to this one. Again, I listen to the way people phrase the question. For us, if somebody does not identify as a victim of something, that is where autonomy comes in, and that is meeting people where they are. And so there's an underlying assumption that somehow advocates or social service providers or agents of the state know better than the person knows their own life. So that's my short answer to that, is if somebody is telling you something from their own agency, that you should believe them, because we are all experts on our own life and nobody knows somebody's life better than that person.
Do you want to add anything, Senator?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I would just say that this emphasizes why it's so important for us to make resources and services available to people regardless of whether or not they self-identify as a victim, a survivor, a sex worker. And that's part of the motivation of decriminalizing, that ideally it would make it easier for people to be comfortable, not just reporting, but also seeking out services, knowing that they wouldn't necessarily need to go through law enforcement to do so.
Great question. Anyone else want to answer?
I kind of want to add a little wrinkle to that, though. I would say 40 years ago, no one knew what domestic violence was. It was acceptable for a husband to beat his wife. So if a woman comes into the ER and she's got a black eye and a broken arm, what, I didn't cook dinner in time. I think that identifying and letting people know, particularly, I'm gonna use DV victims, that that's not okay. You can do something about that. While I understand that the play with agency, it's also identifying that that's not something that should be considered acceptable to you, or that you don't have a choice. So I think that it's okay to still educate people that it's great if your example was, someone who was trafficked as a child or exploited as a child, but is now an adult. If they truly have come to terms and have chosen sex work. But again, just recognizing that there are times where in the past where we've seen, agencies, legislation, whomever have come forward to say there are other things that have happened to people on a grand scale that we've now considered unacceptable. And I think it's appropriate to, when necessary, educate people on that so that they don't think that they're stuck in their situation.
Terrific. Any other questions? Yes, you come down to the mic. It's easier for RJ to hear if you're on the mic. Thank you for that.
All right, great panel. Thank you all for being here. I was wondering if one were to theoretically legalize sex work, people who serve in managerial capacities over sex workers, or even platforms like OnlyFans, Pornhub, whatever it might be, would their responsibilities be adequately encapsulated just by the existing mechanisms we have for holding managers, and businesses accountable for their workers? Or would we want something more robust or something different for ensuring that, their workers are adequately taken care of?
Great question. Okay, RJ, take it away.
So for us as worker rights advocates, decriminalization is a starting point, not an ending point. And many of us who believe in full decriminalization are not opposed to human rights-based regulation. We believe in regulation that is human rights-based. I want to emphasize that, which unfortunately many labor regulations are not. But we, first of all, want the enforcement of existing human rights-based labor protections. New York City is a place where there are many, including for some freelance workers, independent contractors. But right now, even in the legal sectors of the sex trades, which we have not talked about today, strippers, adult film performers, some online workers, and so forth, that are doing legal work are not having their rights enforced around wage theft, sexual harassment, racial discrimination. All those things are rampant in the legal sectors of the sex trades. I myself have seen it firsthand as a person working in strip clubs and in the porn industry. So we advocate for existing protections for workers in the legal sectors to actually be enforced, and try to educate workers that they have rights, because many do not know they do. And there's also an assumption that sex workers cannot be sexually harassed. Sex workers are sexually harassed all the time, myself included, but that exists across labor sectors. So we don't seek out to demonize sex work because people are sexually harassed. That exists in all labor sectors, unfortunately. So enforcing regulations that already exist. Now, in the sectors that are criminalized, full service work, escorting, decriminalization is a first step. There needs to be a wide scale, intentional framing of what types of regulation would best serve workers. And New Zealand has some really good examples of that, where workers were part and parcel of creating policies to protect their rights and safety. So to your exact question around managers, decriminalization would simply mean we are not arresting people for doing things like my ex-boyfriend driving me to sessions with clients when he can be seen as facilitating prostitution, or a 19-year-old, for example, being charged as a trafficker for helping keep safe and do harm reduction practices with their fellow worker who's 17 years old. So these are ways in which the law intentionally or not criminalizes or targets people who are actually not harming anyone. So managers is a very broad term. We say third parties because it's actually more correct to say third parties. So buyers, sellers, and third parties, which could include managers. But people who are third parties need to be held accountable to not exploiting workers, but also should not be criminalized under the equality or Nordic or in demand model for helping workers, which in many cases they are, whether that's providing housing, rides, harm reduction, safety planning, et cetera.
Anyone else on the panel want to respond?
Well, I'm just sort of curious then, because if RJ, if you're saying that you want to work within the framework of, not using state agents in order to facilitate a regulated structure where, managers are held accountable for exploiting workers in the same way that a person who abuses a worker by forcing them to work long hours or live in the location where they're working or work with locks on doors. And by the way, like we haven't really talked about the fact that labor trafficking is a very serious issue. It often gets overshadowed by the issue of sex trafficking in these types of debates. But how would that structure work then without agents that are using the mechanism of, say, like a Department of Labor inspector, which has law enforcement capacity, to have criminal, repercussions for that person? What would a system like that look like?
Let me clarify. Nora, my organization is anarchist, and what I meant by state agents, I've never said we were opposed to state agents being involved in anything. We're opposed to the police harassing, committing violence against, profiling, or arresting people who are doing adult consensual work. And we're also against state agents, AKA police and other law enforcement, being the primary identifiers of people who are vulnerable or experiencing exploitation. But we are worker rights advocates and we are workers. So of course we are for the protection of workers, including all the things you just named, Professor Cronin. We do not want people's freedom of movement limited. We are for absolute choice in people's working conditions, and we want people to be thriving and experiencing positive working conditions. I agree with you as well. I want to say that labor trafficking is often overlooked and it's extremely under-resourced because the topic of sex trafficking for some is voyeuristic, titillating, whatever it may be, where the sex part is focused on more than the trafficking part. That's really unfortunate. We actually, even though we understand that under US law, there are two different paradigms, we believe under a human rights framework, sex trafficking is labor trafficking, one type of labor trafficking, because sex work is work. I often ask people who support and demand or equality or Nordic models, why people want to abolish or end the demand for the sex trades to curb human trafficking, but never ever suggest that for other labor sectors, that we curb the demand for farm labor or domestic labor or restaurant labor or construction labor or any other labor sector where trafficking is pervasive. And that's because there's an underlying anti-sex work agenda, not only an anti-trafficking agenda.
I have a specific question to Senator Salazar. What are the prospects of passing your bill in 2023? If you can answer that.
I can answer it, but thank you. But it is certainly, hypothetical. Not just with this bill, but as always, in trying to predict what the legislature will do in the new session. To be completely frank, I am very realistic about this, as are all of the advocates who I speak about this and who are advocating for the bill. We can't at once say that this issue is fraught with stigma and misunderstanding and say this is going to pass next year with overwhelming support. I think that realistically, we have more education to do about the issue, about decriminalization versus legalization. We have to focus also on resources for people who are being exploited and really build out more support for people who are currently in the sex industry. I'm not I wouldn't say that that is a necessary precursor to decriminalization, but that we need to be doing that simultaneously as we advocate for this. And right now, my assessment is that it's going to take more time for us to really get the public to understand this issue, and to bring more sex workers and former sex workers and sex worker advocates out of the shadows in order for us to win.
Okay. Fair. Yes, go ahead.
I wanted to see if maybe you could elaborate a little bit on like if sex work is decriminalized and then it's legalized, and then we have like a campaign where, let's say it's in New York State, right? And we have a campaign where like in the media and the news, and we educate everyone that this just passed, there's this option now for everyone. How could that not diminish trafficking or like the exploitation? I think that was very surprised by the statistic. Like there's countries where even though it's been decriminalized, then you still have like people are exploiting people, and people, that relationship kind of like tripped me up. So if you could maybe like, if we do a big campaign and we do educate everyone, wouldn't that diminish that in theory? I mean, why is it opposite if it is?
Do you want me to actually cite the study? I have the whole study here with me. Yeah, so again, I brought it with me. I can actually read through just the high points. But the study was done on 113 countries where decriminalization had occurred. Countries with legalized prostitution are associated with higher human trafficking inflows than countries where prostitution is prohibited. The scale effect of legalizing prostitution, expansion of the market, outweighs the substitution effect where legal sex workers are favored over illegal workers. On average, countries with legalized prostitution report a greater incident of human trafficking inflows. You would think, but that's the data says otherwise. So
Go ahead, Artie. I know you have.
I didn't want to interrupt. I didn't want to interrupt.
Do you have anything else for the?
No, that's fine. Go ahead.
Okay, so RJ, go ahead, and then I know you have a follow-up question. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, there's actually data and studies that say the exact opposite. And Professor Salazar early on had mentioned New Zealand, where there is quite a bit of data. We have white papers, we have surveys of sex workers, law enforcement, and so forth from New Zealand that does have full decriminalization, that showed that rates of human trafficking did decrease, that people were less vulnerable to trafficking. And so, you know, you have to take data with a grain of salt. As I'm sure we all know, studies can be influenced by the agenda of the people doing that study in all directions, not just directions I don't agree with. And so it is also very hard to collect data in this country on this issue because of stigma and because of criminalization. So our organization, for example, advocates at the federal level for the Safe Sex Worker Study Act. I would hope that everyone across the spectrum of opinion around these issues could get behind that, because all it does is simply say we need to study the impacts of legislation like SESTA FOSTA on trafficking survivors and people doing consensual sex work. And there is a dearth of data around the sex trades in this country, particularly, not just participatory action data, not just community-based anecdotal data, but government-backed scientific data around these issues. So one thing I always point out is data is deeply lacking, even on basic questions we get asked every day about how many people are sex workers. If someone tells you they know how many people are in the sex trades, that's not true. There's no way to know that. Most people are not out, and most people cannot be out because of stigma and criminalization. So you can look at many different studies and see ones that say that decriminalization decreases the risk of trafficking and actual incidences of trafficking. And you can also read studies from organizations that are being cited, like Polaris and others, are inherently anti-sex work organizations. So it's very important to look at the source of the data that you're citing and what their political agenda is.
Does that answer your question or do you have a follow-up?
Yeah, well, I would just say that if it's 113 countries, right? I wonder if it's a cultural thing. Or
It's
like,
not 113 countries. There's only 2 countries on the planet that have full decriminalization.
okay, well,
Are there 113?
of the studies that conducted the study, I think that's what it was.
Our empirical analysis for a cross-section of up to 150 countries shows that the scale effect dominates the substitution effect. On average, countries where prostitution is legal experience larger reported human trafficking inflows.
So that also includes legalization. Okay. All right. Are there other questions from the audience?
Just wanted to add.
Oh, sure,
No,
please
just
do.
a quick comment. And agree with what RJ mentioned about, there are reports, studies from a variety of sources, both peer-reviewed journals, some are reports from like the Ministry of Justice that looked at the Netherlands, although not this is where there's legalization rather than decrim, but putting that aside, what I would offer is in these other cases where data indicated that trafficking had increased, perhaps it's relying on reporting. And if in fact decriminalization and or legalization allows for more people who are victims, survivors to report, then it is actually possible that while you wouldn't actually see an increase in trafficking, you would see people who previously were afraid to report, willing to report. I mean, this is hypothetical, but that's what I would expect.
I can use a real life example. My colleague on the sex trafficking committee, Jane Biggelson, she works for Covenant House in New York City. Ever since Walking While Trans was repealed, they have pimps sitting outside recruiting kids more because there's no consequence. So while again, I recognize it's, one time, an individual study, it's not even a study, it's an individual example. It's an example of what's happening now that there are no repercussions. There's the increase in demand is there. The concern for traffic, for prior, well, I don't want to say prior victims, persons who are trying to get out of trafficking, they're being re-recruited. So again, I'm sure there's other examples, but Jane just, made sure I brought that up today. You could go by Covenant House and there are people sitting outside trying to recruit their kids.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so Brian Flaherty asks, was there anything further on that? Are end demand countries included in the legalized prostitution countries? So in the study of increases in trafficking in countries where prostitution is legalized. So I'm assuming you mean like the Nordic model countries, are those included? Because it is decriminalizing in part, and that might be
Yes.
doing.
Yes.
So the Nordic model, for those who aren't familiar, and that it started in kind of the Scandinavian states, but it's also in France and Israel, and so it had decriminalized acts on the part of the prostituted, the sex workers, but they will still criminalize the purchasers and the traffickers. And so if you're counting all of those countries, that's probably where the 113 came from.
Correct.
And then it's probably a mixed bag, based upon all the things that everybody has mentioned. So thank you, Brian, for raising that point. Are there other questions from the audience? Yes, please. Okay.
I'll repeat.
So I heard all of the statistics, clearly they were geared towards sex trafficking. What about the statistics because of this criminalization, where we're criminalizing purchasers and buyers, the people that are not trafficking, that if we legalize this or decriminalize this, the people that are freely in this enterprise, what are the statistics that these people that are in? Because I didn't hear clear statistics on
those individuals, so who would benefit from legalization? Because obviously, if we decriminalize maybe some sex trafficking would increase according to some studies, or that is what we're worried about. But what are the statistics that would benefit from it? Okay, so, and just to clarify, when you say people that would benefit, are you talking about the demand side or the supply side? The people that are willingly not being forced into this. I think it's. All of that. Yeah, okay. So does anyone know, and I know RJ, you said it's really hard to get statistics, which we know in this area. Does anyone know in terms of that, in terms of whether, you know, those who would benefit from decriminalization, what are those statistics? What is that data bearing out? Is that what you're asking? You want to go ahead? Sure.
Yeah, I mean, I can share some of the data, the information that I have from scientists for sex workers' rights. First, that I mentioned the 2015 Ministry of Justice report from the Netherlands, and again, that this is a place where they have a legal industry rather than simply decriminalization, but it found that the ability to monitor sex businesses and operators sector-wide standards resulted in public health and safety in the sector. They also monitored non-licensed operators, which would mean in this case like freelance escorts or home-based providers. And there also was a study comparing cities in Australia where they each had a different legal regime. So decriminalization and legalization, found that a policy of legalization is at least superior to criminalization in terms of health protections and working conditions. So that's less of the more like holistic outcomes from these reports. But I had mentioned that research on full decriminalization of sex work in New Zealand and New South Wales, Australia, 90% of the sex workers who were in the report believe that decriminalization has improved their employment and legal rights. 60% of sex workers stated that decriminalization enabled them to more easily screen and refuse potentially dangerous clients, and that sex workers actually reported across the board increased access to condoms and increased use of condoms. And that might seem kind of weird, like what does contraception have to do with it? But you know, even in New York State, there have been times when someone was, it was used in criminal prosecution, the fact that they carried condoms with them as evidence of participating in prostitution, whether selling or buying sex.
It seems like all of the data is just for trafficking, why we don't want to legalize it, but I don't hear any data for what they're arguing, why we should legalize it. So. Does that satisfy? Yeah. Okay. Terrific.
Well,
And I believe, Senator, you did say that in the beginning, but that because she was the first speaker, maybe, you know, it kind of got lost when, you know, so thank you for reiterating that. Oh, okay.
So there's a state in the United States called Nevada. Nevada has 11 counties that allow prostitution. You would think where there's free, you know, available, non-regulated sex work, there would be no trafficking. That's not the case. So even just to use something, I don't want to say closer to home, but a state where they use that, they have incorporated legalizing prostitution. And you know, you can be in a brothel, you don't have to. There are, again, there's studies that have come out showing that we're not talking, you know, one person, two people. A third to a fourth of women that are working in brothels, again, legally in Nevada, have been red flagged for being traffic victims. So we have examples where just because it's legal, it's freely available, people can even be sex tourists and go there. Trafficking still it can be an issue. And it shouldn't be that if it's not a big enough number or a big enough statistic, that it shouldn't matter. The fact that they're interlaced means that there is more to the issue than just decriminalizing it. Because again, we can see where just decriminalizing it and legalizing it even does not end the problem.
And I have a couple questions now too, but
I
let me
just
start.
wanted to clarify some facts about Nevada that that is a highly regulated, and that's an example of a not human rights-based regulatory scheme of the brothel system. It does nothing in those counties in Nevada to decriminalize street-based sex work. There are no benefits to male sex workers, trans sex workers for the most part. The sex workers that are working in the brothel system are mainly cisgender women. They have to meet the requirements of the brothel owners. It is a very patriarchal, for-profit system that benefits brothel owners. That we do not oppose legalization of that sort, but it's really important to clarify that is not decriminalization and that it is not free-flowing, freely available sex work. That's not a correct characterization of the brothel system whatsoever. The brothel system has a lot of labor exploitation problems. But I don't want people leaving thinking that there's decriminalization anywhere in Nevada.
I just wanted to add one other point, because it's very hard to predict what statistics would look like under a different scheme of laws than what we have now. Especially given all of the considerations that we have, given our lack of socialized healthcare in this country and lack of, the people who tend to report may not have trust in law enforcement. But one thing that I think is kind of overlooked that's really clear is that we actually do a terrible job of prosecuting sex trafficking cases now. I looked, and there's only 100 in 2021, which was the last year for statistics. There was only 140 new criminal human trafficking cases filed in US federal courts. That's for the entire country. So federal prosecutors only focused on 140 cases. Now you would think from watching the news, like when you see Jeffrey Epstein or you see Keith Raniere, which was a local case, that we're like, this is, done far and wide, or like Robert Kraft makes the news. But the truth is that the average exploiter, somebody who, is not, who is a trafficker, who we can all agree should be prosecuted because they're an exploitative person. We've mentioned that like this new decriminalization bill would not alter those crimes. We have to do a better job of allowing law enforcement to actually prosecute people who are harming the most vulnerable, prosecuting traffickers. Now, how we could accomplish that is challenging because these are people who are protected by sources of power within, our own structure. But one way might be to assist folks coming forward feel more secure in their own status by giving services that are needed, within the community. Because right now, most traffickers who are exploiting people are kind of allowed to freely operate unless they become so big that like they can't be ignored, like a Jeffrey Epstein or a Keith Raniere, which is really problematic. So like operate without consequence in the country.
Okay, I know we have another question from the audience.
And this was kind of a follow-up to Professor Cronin. But so what do you, if you know, what are common legal issues that tend to arise that are preventing these cases from going forward and causing that number of prosecutions to be so low?
So a lot of it has to do, as I mentioned before, with lack of experience, because this is a new area of law. So a lot of prosecutors just don't have the experience prosecuting these kinds of cases, and law enforcement doesn't have the experience investigating them. It's very expensive to do a kind of RICO case where you have to look at tax records and financial information. Oh, and by the way, I would also add that banks and should be held responsible if they are facilitating trafficking.
And hotels.
Yes. So these are also corporate structures that need to be looked at that are in place to protect those who are most powerful in our society. And I would also say that, for the same reason that a lot of folks won't come forward to report being trafficked, trafficking is a crime. Nobody comes into a police station and says, I'm a human trafficking victim, help me. That just is not a thing. So how do people feel secure? And I think this is one place where we can all work together on every side of the debate to make people feel like they can participate meaningfully in being, part of, of getting benefits so that they can, move with their lives in a significant, move towards a solution in a significant way. And whether or not they want to be, and I think we also mentioned civil remedies for victims. A lot of folks don't even realize that's available, specifically for labor trafficking victims too, because labor trafficking victims get into labor trafficking situations because they want to work, and they are then exploited and often don't receive money. And I would say as trafficking victims will receive the payment for their services.
Thank you. Does that answer your question?
Absolutely.
Okay. I will ask a question, and anyone can also feel free to join, but Professor Cronin mentioned vulnerable populations. My particular area of focus is child sex trafficking. And so I'm wondering how do we balance that, not being paternalistic, but at the same time still protect our most vulnerable, including children? If anybody wants to answer that. This is my problem. I don't know how to answer. This is why I'm doing the research, right? It's not an easy question to answer. I mean, that's the problem. Does anyone have ideas? I'm certain.
I know that as survivors, and I thought RJ would jump in. So as somebody who's involved in the work, I want to make sure that, we have spaces for survivors to participate in a meaningful way in these discussions, because that's something that we've included as part of response to human trafficking programs that we administered through the Bureau of Refugee Services. We included a survivor advisory board. Now, I'm sure there's definitely ways, and maybe RJ, you could even elucidate me on how you feel the best way to engage a survivor to make sure that their voice is actually meaningfully heard, because that to me seems like a smart move.
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly, and happy to, continue the dialogue with you, Professor Cronin, from SWP's experience beyond this event. But yeah, I agree wholeheartedly that survivor voices, just like sex worker voices, need to be included. And in our experience, once again, those are two populations that intersect and overlap, not always, but sometimes, but two populations of people that we do provide legal services to. And we have had, when we used to provide social services, we no longer do at SWP because of funding, but for the years we did provide social services, we had survivor leadership groups as well as sex worker leadership groups. And we had tried at different points in time to have those be different groups, overlapping groups. And there was a lot of healing in those spaces with people from vastly different experiences of exploitation to very positive experiences in the sex trades, hearing one another and being able to come to a place of healing. But I think that, I don't identify as a survivor of trafficking. I'm not a survivor of trafficking. And so I think it's really, I try to speak from the perspective of one sex worker, but it's crucial that survivor voices be present. And I would say a diversity of survivor voices, because just like there's not one experience among sex workers, there is not one monolithic experience of a survivor of trafficking. And there are survivors of trafficking that are very adamantly pro-decrim, and there are survivors of trafficking that don't want to talk about sex work because of the trauma they've experienced, and everything in between.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So I would just add, again, what we see in traffic victims is mostly folks that are from marginalized groups, a lot of runaways, people in foster care, people who have been abused by family members, again, community leaders, religious leaders, maybe a coach. And so I think always making sure that our youth, because we're talking about child sex trafficking, know that, if something happens to them, that it's not okay, that there's places for them to go, safe places, and that they have resources. Again, a lot of times we see with child traffic victims, they were in foster care, someone was abusing them in foster care, they run away, and then they're on the streets. They don't have any options. So just making sure that our youth have, the resources they need, and that they understand there are places, safe places to go to get the things that they need.
And just so I want to make sure everyone leaves this discussion today, we might assume everybody's hearing this, but I don't know if everyone is hearing that the decrim bill in New York, and all decrim bills I've ever been involved with or seen, maintain and protect the safeguards that are in place for exploitation of minors. And we are only advocating for the decriminalization of adult consensual sex work.
Thank you for clarifying that. So I'm going to bring another sort of topic because RJ, you mentioned that we didn't really talk about, let's say, strip club, pornography. How many have heard of the term sugaring in the audience? Okay, not that many. I know when I first heard it, it took me a really long time to figure out what the heck is that. So the sugaring is the idea of, there's a lot of websites, sugar daddies and sugar babies where you can link, where these sort of websites will link college students with older, wealthier individuals and sort of have a consensual sexual relationship, but there is money involved. And I wondered if anyone wanted to comment at all about, anything that we've talked about today, where would sugaring fall in that regard?
This is really interesting because this goes exactly back to the terminology point that you made at the beginning.
Okay.
Because I would say that a lot of, one of the terms that we didn't even define was sex work, because there are people who will believe, who don't consider themselves sex workers who are sugaring. There's people who identify themselves as sex workers who are. There are people that define sex work only if you're having intercourse. So that's a very, very aptly poised question. And I don't know, if that, what the answer to that is, maybe.
And
But
also,
again, we're going back to an imbalance of power. And I recognize that, my co-panelists believe that it's patriarchal or it's not, it's anti-feminist. I believe that, and as do my, my co-chairs on the sex trafficking committee, it starts with the imbalance of power. Somebody with money is reaching out to someone who is vulnerable. These people reaching out are not reaching out to other people in their golf club circle. They're reaching out to people in college or people who are in need of money. And that right there is an example of how there was an imbalance of power and they're taking advantage of that situation.
I would just like to add, as someone who has experienced this in my own lived life, not theoretically, that sex work saves many young adults' lives, including many LGBT people's lives who have, it also, saves and benefits the lives of people who are undocumented, people who are trans and gender nonconforming, that have many layers of barriers to jobs in the formal economies. And many of our clients are trans and undocumented. When you are a trans undocumented person, the idea that you should not be engaging in sex work is highly problematic, highly moralistic, and not realistic. And also, sex work, again, I think some people are not hearing that these are not binary experiences. All clients are not our enemies. All clients are not exploitative. In many of our lives, and again, this cuts across race, gender, many different diverse experiences of our identities as people in the sex trades have built beautiful relationships with clients and customers that are affirming, that are uplifting. I have many colleagues, including Black trans women, who share the experience that they have had mutually beneficial and even very positive and beautiful relationships with clients, not only financially, but we have a film at the Sex Workers Project that shows the healing power of sex work for both workers and clients, emotionally, physically, sexually, and even spiritually. I've introduced clients to Buddhism. We, as sex workers, help people overcome all sorts of anxiety, sexual performance issues, people who are dealing with suicidal levels of loneliness and depression. And as I said before, I have friends who have provided end-of-life care consensually for clients who wanted that. So these are things that we don't hear about. We hear about this victim narrative constantly. And sometimes we hear about this happy hooker narrative as well. And at SWP, we're not into perpetuating these extreme narratives, although some people fall into extremes. But what happens to the vast majority of people who fall somewhere in the middle, who have good days and bad days at work, who have exploitative experiences and empowering experiences? That is the lived reality of workers, and not just in the sex trades, but in the vast majority of labor sectors. And I would also push people's boundaries to think about what is, what coercion can look like. Coercion can look many ways. It is not only sort of Law and Order, SUV types of Hollywood forms of exploitation. The type of work people do or don't do can also be coerced by societal expectations, by family expectations. If you think about, why you went to law school, why you were a server at one point in your life, circumstance, choice, and coercion overlap and intersect in all of our lives with varying degrees of privilege and varying degrees of marginalization. And I keep wanting to problematize these extreme and binary narratives because they just don't represent many people's reality. And lastly, I would say, some people have this myth that there are only very privileged sex workers, for example, full-time indoor escorts, and then other people are always marginalized. That is not true. There are privileged, high-end people, in high-end income people in every sector of the sex trades, porn, stripping, escorting. There are also people who are experiencing marginalization in all of those sectors. There were, young men in Chicago who were, did have their freedom of movement curtailed in the porn industry, who were basically doing porn in exchange for housing, and they were highly exploited. But you don't hear about men and boys who are experiencing exploitation in the sex trade. So I name all these different things to say that the issues are complex and complicated, just like human beings' lives are. And when we reduce them to narrow narratives that make people think that everyone is a victim and all clients are exploiters, it's just simply not true, and it's not helpful.
Certainly, this dialogue today has been nuanced, has been complicated, has really been remarkable. We're having lots of different views aired, which is exactly, I know, what Julia had hoped for. Are there any last questions before we break? Well, I want to thank our wonderful speakers, and I want to thank you as an engaged audience. Again, this has been a really remarkable intellectual dialogue about a topic that we often don't want to talk about. So thank you to Julia for shining a light, for letting us have this open dialogue. And for you in the audience, thank you for being engaged. And now we will treat you to a reception in the foyer, which I wish RJ could join us. I'll send you some shrimp through the Zoom.
Thank you.
So please do join us in the foyer for more discussion.
Thank you, everyone.